this is having a big impact on honest UK businesses who are being undercut unfairly, with some going to the wall and having to lay off staff. This is also, of course, depriving public services of vital funds at a time of austerity. If you take just the lower estimate of HMRC's own figures, which would be £1 billion a year, that's lost to the Exchequer, but that would cover approximately a year of the increase in public sector pay that we're discussing in Parliament this week. And of course, with Brexit looming, British business needs more support to make sure that we maintain our competitiveness. And we, of course, none of us want to see the UK as a soft touch. It's a really important issue for those individual businesses and for taxpayers in general. So today we have two witness panels. So our first panel is made up of Richard Allen of RAVAS, an organisation campaigning on this issue, and Professor Rita de la Feria, who's the Professor of International Tax Law at the University of Leeds. So a very warm welcome to you. Mr. Allen, do you think you could kick off by explaining what the impact of this has been on the businesses that are trading legitimately and paying their VAT here in the UK?
Yes. Firstly, can I say it's fantastic that this committee is looking at this issue, because for a long time we've been trying to get this onto the kind of high-profile radar, and I'd like to thank Meg and Chris Heaton-Harris, Charlie Elphick and my MP Cheryl Gillen for really pushing this. The way it affects business is 20% is a large sum of money if you can avoid paying it, and in fact it's an entire margin on many products. So if you're facing competitors that are avoiding 20%, you can't compete. So the impact on business is extremely bad, particularly in the UK, if you're a British business competing against somebody importing goods and evading VAT.
Okay, and Rita, in your experience, Professor de la Feria, apologies, in your experience...
You can call me Rita.
We'd like to be I think the people watching want to know that you're a professor, I think. But Professor de la Feria, in your experience, do you think that HMRC's estimates for a start are in the right ballpark? And do you have any experience of what's happening in other countries to tackle this issue?
Okay, so it's very difficult to measure fraud. That's the first point. I mean, if we knew exactly where it was, we would go in after it. So all we can do is estimates. So I assume that the calculations that Hmrc are doing are sophisticated with the several variables. So I would tend to rely on until I have proof to the contrary, I tend to rely on their estimates as regards the size of the fraud. As regards the way it's being tackled, there is some concerns. First of all, there is the Olaf report recently that accused Hmrc of not properly policing the borders and allowing goods to enter the European Union via the UK without any tax on it. But there is also evidence across various actions that Hmrc have been taking that indicates to me that the primary concern of Hmrc has been to collect revenue disregarding the other potential costs of fraud. Now, in many situations, going after the revenue is the same as combating fraud. So if you're going after a restaurant because the restaurant hasn't paid taxes, you are helping to collect more revenue. At the same time, you're ensuring that the other restaurants are in the equal playing field to that fraudster restaurant. But in some situations, that is not the case. So if you're going after the revenue, you might not care so much about the small amount of VAT that is lost on online sales, because each sale is of a small amount. And therefore, if you're just looking for the revenue, you may think that it's not worth the costs of policing those sales. But the actual fact is that beyond those revenue costs, there is massive other costs, as Richard has said, for small traders, for a sense of equality and fairness in the system that are being undermined by not essentially enforcing the tax on those situations where maybe it might not be so cost effective to do so, okay, but there is other advantages.
Okay, so Richard Allen, I mean, you represent the retailers against VAT abuse schemes. How many retailers are, I mean, it's small items, small amounts of money for each item, but how many retailers are actually being affected by this? And can you give us an indication of how many have been put out of business as a result?
Well, it's difficult to estimate how many people are affected by this, but it must be a large number, because I mean, the reason Retailers Against VAT Abuse schemes exists is because we weren't seeing any action from Hmrc, and I'm not here to criticise Hmrc because they have their own resourcing issues, but the reality is that we saw no action whatsoever. And I've lost count of the number of people that have contacted me saying that they're being affected by this. And you only need to actually go onto Amazon or eBay and buy things, and you can find easily products that are where there's no VAT. So in every sector I could think of where the goods are of a relatively low value, this is happening, and it's expanding because there's money to be made.
Okay, and you provided this information to Hmrc, presumably?
Yes, I mean, we've been providing information for quite some time. I teamed up with another group called vatfraud.org, who produced a very extensive website full of information on this. But I recently, myself, I placed a test order before this meeting, and I ordered an item from a company on Amazon that we know isn't charging VAT. They admitted it. It was gift wrapped by Amazon, so this is a gift wrapped fraudulent transaction. Turned up next day. The money went to China, and it's very easy to find these companies doing this, and I think that proves it. And that transaction wouldn't happen if that supply chain wasn't in existence.
Okay. Caroline Flint.
Would I be correct in saying that when the purchaser bought that, the money would have been handled potentially by PayPal or someone?
Yeah, the money would go...
and a fee would have been deducted before sending it back to the seller?
The money would go straight to the seller in China, and the item came from a warehouse in Fife. Sorry, no, this was American, actually. The money went to an American seller. The item came from Fife next day. And as I say, I requested gift wrapping. The gift wrapping charge was made to Amazon.
Amazon, sorry,
yeah.
Amazon. But Amazon do sort of handle the money, unlike, eBay.
Yes, the charge on my...
They take their charge, and then the money goes to the seller.
The charge was made to my card by Amazon Payment Services. So Amazon took the money.
Okay. So what do you think then, Rita LaFair, about Hmrc's reactions? As you said, it seems a lot of small transactions might not be worth their while pursuing it. Do you think they're doing enough, and what more could they do to tackle this problem?
I suspect that they aren't. I'm sympathetic to their situation. Like Richard, I'm not here necessarily to accuse Hmrc of not doing enough, but I'm sympathetic to the problem of costs. But my sense is that this is a cost-benefit analysis that they are making on each of these enforcements. And the problem with that is that it's very proper and suitable that cost-benefit analyses are made prior to writing the law down. So tax policy should be guided, as with other fundamental issues such as equity and neutrality. It should be guided by efficiency. You shouldn't try to collect taxes on something that enforcing the tax upon it will cost you more than what you're going to get. However, enforcement shouldn't be guided for that, because from the moment that the law is written down, the law should be applied to everyone the same way.
Okay, well, we've had a change, of course, in the law in the last year where there's a 30-day window for the online marketplaces to identify where they've identified someone, a company not registered for VAT, to get them to be registered or kick them off the platform.
Well, Professor, how effective do you think that's going to be? Some have suggested it will just tip people off, and they might therefore shut themselves down and reform as another company and carry on the practices.
That is possible. It's also possible that these online traders will start using other online platforms that are less well known, that not Amazon, not eBay. But it's also true that the majority of business goes through those platforms. So there will be people that will go to the smaller platforms, more darker or more hidden on the web. But the majority of us will still buy on Amazon, on eBay. So if we can curtail the use of those platforms that are mostly used by the public by fraudsters, then I would say that we'll get a big chunk of the fraud. There will be something that will be missed out, but I think that it's still worth pursuing that avenue.
Richard Allen, what do you think about the 30-day rule?
Well, I was actually asked about that before they introduced it. I had a problem with it because it's dressed up as third-party liability, and third-party liability should be the same as, say, stolen goods. If you handle stolen goods, you know you're going to get in trouble. Whereas the problem with this is that HMRC has to spot the fraud first, then they have to issue a notice, then Amazon or eBay has the choice of removing the seller, and if they do so, they avoid the liability. So in my view, no one's ever going to be liable. And of course, they never get the VAT back because the VAT evaders run off. We know goods are being sent back to them when they're closed down. But one thing I just wanted to point out there was it's important to remember now that everybody expects next day delivery. You can't do a next day delivery from Lithuania. So this is why these goods are sitting in warehouses in the UK, because people want it next day. So if you clamp down on that, there might be competitors that are offering you VAT-free transactions, but they just won't be convenient and they'll have to come by a difficult route.
I should just add before I bring in Nigel Mills that, of course, you're talking about eBay and Amazon. They are witnesses today. There are many online marketplace platforms. They just happen to be
the dominant ones,
with a big reach. That's why they're witnesses today, not particularly singling them out. There are plenty of others. So Nigel Mills, and I think Gillian Keegan wanted to come in as well.
Professor, the first question I have, I think you've kind of worked quite extensively around the world in various places. I mean, do you think HMRC are ahead of the curve in tackling this kind of fraud, or are we behind and catching up, or is this a uniquely British issue?
It's not uniquely British. Everyone is struggling with digital economy. It came very quickly, and the systems are having difficulties adapting to it. So it's not unique. And some of the trends that we can witness on Hmrc as regards enforcement can be seen as regards other tax authorities, not only in Europe, but you can see it in Canada, for example, in Brazil. The same kind of attitude of cost-benefit analysis to enforcement. Taking efficiency to be the prime criteria for enforcement. You can see those trends in other countries as well, but that doesn't make it right. And then, as regards the policing, the borders, the reports that we're getting at European level is that the UK borders are some of the worst policed in Europe.
So, do you have any examples of any countries in the world that have found a way of making sure they can collect their various sales taxes or VAT taxes on online transactions?
In Europe, the new third-party liability rule is basically an attempt to do that. I can talk a little bit more if you want about the third-party liability rule, but in essence, it means that if you knew or you should have known that fraud had been committed, then you're liable for the VAT that goes uncollected. And that is a move in that direction to try and address the potential for frauds that are coming from outside Europe. If they are in Europe, it's easier to track them down. But if they come from outside Europe, the enforcement to them is almost impossible, which is why we have developed that rule in Europe. Australia has also developed their own methods with the so-called Netflix tax. So there is different countries trying to address the problems. And I don't think that the UK is unique in the situation that they're facing. It's just that, and I don't even think that the law is particularly wrong. On this, Richard and I don't see eye to eye. I think that the new legislation that has been introduced will help. It won't solve all the problems, but it will be helpful. But I do think that there is a serious problem on enforcement. So I don't think that the law is wrong. I think that the enforcement is not up to scratch.
Nigel Mills.
And do you think HMRC have tried to use the existing laws as strongly as they could? I mean, there's some suggestion that they could use the Kittel principle and try and get the money out of the marketplaces. I mean, I'm not sure the agent principle rules were quite designed with this situation in mind, where you've got the agent effectively fulfilling the transaction, acting on behalf of the buyer if there's a dispute with the seller, and all those kind of like vetting and compliance issues going on. I mean, do you think perhaps the law could be interpreted a bit more strongly to make sure we perhaps don't suffer this level of VAT fraud?
That is my opinion. That is good.
So can I comment on that?
Sorry, yes, Mr. Allen.
That's an evidential issue. I mean, as to whether or not marketplaces know what's going on. My own view is that, from what I've seen, is that nobody has really taken this issue to task and basically said, you must know this is happening. I mean, for instance, this. I personally would find it difficult to understand how it could be argued that you didn't know this thing was going on your marketplace. And I know the Americans have come, there's a court case at the moment in America on sales tax in Georgia, where the authorities there are taking Amazon to task, saying that you are actually the supplier, not these third parties, and that could go to the Supreme Court, apparently.
Last one, Nigel.
There's a legal case, Professor, that Amazon or eBay or Alibaba or whoever else are actually making the sale here and should account for the VAT, or do you think that's just...
I actually think there is two transactions at stake, but this is not exactly the issue as regards online fraud. This is kind of a separate issue, I guess. But I think that there is two transactions at stake from a legal perspective. There is a transaction between the seller and the customer, and there is another transaction, a separate one, whereby these platforms supply intermediary services. They basically put together the seller and the customer. And that is valid not only for Amazon and eBay, but for Uber or Google, or so a series of other digital businesses. And I think that there is a separate supply that should be subject to VAT. This is not an issue of fraud, it's an issue of interpreting what is the scope of the tax. And I do think that the scope of the tax includes that. We were just talking outside how the Estonian presidency, the EU Estonian presidency, is looking at this particular issue, whether these digital businesses should be subject to a VAT on that intermediary services. And I have said as recent as May in Brussels that I think that is my opinion.
I just want to say that we are working with our sister committees, including, of course, the Treasury Select Committee, to make sure that we deal with the value for money, the collection of this sort of tax. They will be dealing with the policy, so we'll be making sure we liaise. So we'll feed your comments into them, Professor Zaffaria. I think Nigel Mills had one quick point, and then Gillian Keegan. I could just remind members of the committee that we have just under 10 minutes left on this session. So, Mr. Mills.
I suppose I was just going to clarify. I mean, what I was alluding to was whether the two transactions are Amazon sells to buyer and then has a separate transaction with the seller. So you can get VAT on the full transaction. I think what you're suggesting, that VAT on that second transaction will be a very small amount for that service, wouldn't it?
That
what's
might
being
be the
defrauded
case.
is the VAT on the amount that the seller paid, that the buyer paid, isn't it? That's what we want to get to.
I mean, the amount might be small, but the issue is that they are providing a service, a value added. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. Otherwise, people would just meet in literally on the market and sell to each other. But they don't. They are supplying a value added to the production chain, and I think that value added should be recognised for VAT purposes.
It's an important point, but a policy issue that's beyond the reach of this committee, but we'll bank that as an area of interest. Gillian Keegan.
Thank you, Professor De La Freira. You mentioned that quite a lot's going on actually globally, and it appears that the legislation we have, perhaps in many parts of the world, have not been written with this in mind. You mentioned Georgia, Estonia. And we've also had some recent rule changes, very recent, September last year. In your opinion, how long before we have the data to show the effectiveness of what's been put in place so far, and also the results of some of these other studies that are happening or some of these other court cases? In other words, if you were to set a target for when we should try and have this closed, what would be a reasonable target?
Well, closed is, I would say that this will always be an open issue.
Improved.
I think you would start seeing results as quickly as 1 year. I mean, if things haven't changed, if practice haven't changed since the law was approved in the last year, then you have a problem, because the reaction should have been more or less immediate. I honestly don't think that... again, this is a point of divergence, but I actually honestly don't think that the problem is necessarily the law. I think it's the way that it's being enforced. I think there is the tools, legally speaking, there is the tools. There was, even before these new amendments that were approved last year, I think there was the tools via the European Court, there was the tools to enforce the tax in a different way. But it was not, this was not done. It was not the policy to do so.
Okay. Jeffrey Clifton Brown.
Professor, you said that the UK borders were one of the worst police borders in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was either you or Richard referred to the OLAF investigation.
I did, yes.
The European Enforcement Agency investigation, which imposed a fine on the UK, I think from memory, of 1.7 billion. Did you follow that case? And did the UK refute any of the evidence? Because if they didn't, what lessons are there to be learned from the UK, from the EU's investigations?
I only have had access to the public reports, so I don't know the exact inquiries that were done by Olaf. But Olaf is a reliable agency. I'm sure they wouldn't have made allegations if they didn't have substance to do so. I think the UK has contested some of the findings. In any event, I find it worrying that the accusations were made in the first place, because I don't think they would have been made if there wasn't evidence to indicate that they were on sound grounds to make them.
Could I say something on that?
It's certainly Mr. Randall.
Our experience has been we have seen huge volumes of Chinese goods in UK warehouses, and they are getting there somehow. So there's obviously a problem, because how are these things getting in and then being sold with no VAT? I'd just like to say, because I know we're drawing to the end here, is that from the perspective of a retailer, there are lots of businesses probably watching this now. If they report one of these companies that's affecting their business, they're not getting any response that deals with it. And I've got one at the moment now, a company called Qualtex, that reported a specific trader to Hmrc, asked them to be closed down. Now, so far they've had a letter from a ministerial response team, but they wrote to Hmrc, and all they want is for somebody to go in and close this trader down. So it's great that everybody's looking at this, but I'd like everyone to bear in mind that businesses can't wait 3 years for a VAT-avoiding competitor to disappear. They'll be gone by that point.
Can you tell us how quick the impact is on a business? Before I come back, Mr. Brown, if a competitor opens up
the
selling
speed of
your
it,
item-
well, happened to me. We lasted, once we started being seriously affected by this, 2 years. By that point, it was unsustainable. We just had to close. So I guess it depends what sector you're in, but that was my experience of it.
Okay, and how many staff did you have?
10 staff. Our total turnover, including assets, was over $1 million. So it was impossible to compete in the end. It's slightly different because we were seeing UK products being sent out to the Channel Islands and then mailed back again.
Yeah.
So anything in the UK eventually became VAT-free. But in this instance, it's different because it's products coming in from outside of the EU. A lot of them, by the way, are also dangerous. There's another substrata to this of dangerous goods coming in, aping UK products, but are of an inferior quality. And because this is a kind of black market, these things get through.
Okay, Mr. Clifton-Brown.
Thank you for those last remarks, because that brings me on to the next question. These warehouses, the fulfilment houses, you seem to think that's where the major problem lies. What would be wrong with making it legal obligation for them to have to register those warehouses so that the Hmrc knew where they all were?
I think that's
I'll make just a small remark on that. There is already a precedent for warehouses to be made liable. A Belgian case a few years back, where the owner of a warehouse was charged by the Belgian tax authorities of being liable to pay the output VAT that had not been paid on goods that was stored in his warehouse. So he was the owner, had leased the premises, so he was not the owner of the goods. But the tax authorities decided that being the owner of the warehouse where goods that were subject of fraud was enough. The European Court on that case deemed that was not the case, but just because the warehouse did not have the ability to know that those goods were going to be used for fraud. If it had fulfilled that test, if the owner of the warehouse, like it appears in some of the cases here, could have known. Maybe it doesn't need to know. It does just need to, the standard of the test is much lower. It just needs to should have known that the fraud was being committed, then he could have been made liable. So where there is already legislation that allows that to happen for the owners of warehouses.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I think we're nearly finished, but I did want to ask you, you mentioned, I think you mentioned Brexit, and I wondered what you think the risks of Brexit are. Will those make it harder or easier for Hmrc to clamp down on this sort of fraud?
Well, from a legal perspective, from a personal perspective, Brexit makes everything harder. But from a legal perspective on this issue, I think that a lot of this anti-fraud legislation is coming through the European Court. So it will have to be essentially embedded into UK legislation post-Brexit. I think on this issue, I think there is a willingness to do so. I don't see the VAT system or VAT law changing that much post-Brexit, except on issues of rates.
And you talked about the creaking at the seams of the system. presumably, if we don't have access to the European market, of course we're speculating because we're still in negotiations, we don't know exactly what will happen. What do you think, will there be implications for HMRC's resources if we have more trade with other countries, and how well will they be able to cope with this, and what will be the impact on consumers and businesses?
Well,
a lot of speculation I'm asking for there, but just give us a flavour of what your
I guess the issue is just literally on the basis of public information. But if you're going to have your own customs border, then you basically will need more staff. Now, if there is an issue already of staff at the borders as it stands, then the issue will become bigger once there is a separation from the customs union. So you will need more resources, more staff, more software, etc.
So from what you're saying, would it follow, maybe I'm speculating here, that if this enforcement was effectively outsourced to various online marketplaces, it would save HMRC a lot of resource, because there could be better police.
You can outsource some, but it won't stop you having to enforce at the borders. Yes. You can make them more liable, more cooperative. You can basically enlist them in your task of enforcing the tax, but you will still have people at the borders. There's no way around that.
Can I thank you both very much, both for coming and for the information you provided us prior to this hearing, and thank you for your patience as we had to delay from the 3rd of May. Our transcript will be up on the website in the next couple of days uncorrected. You'll obviously be sent a copy, and our report will be out in due course, probably sometime in October or November, given the time frame, and we will obviously send you a copy of that. But can I thank you very much? You're very welcome to stay for the next panel. And if I could call our next, so almost 2 panels, but at the same time, if I could call Amazon, eBay and HMRC to the table, please. Thank you. Okay, so... Twitter, there is a hashtag for today's hearing, hashtag VAT, hashtag VAT. Can I welcome our next, it's effectively 2 panels, but we did think there might be questions that you both need to answer at the same time, so we're anxious to be efficient. We're aiming to finish, we have a vote at 4, so if we can be efficient in our questioning and you can be efficient in your answers, your ordeal, your pleasure at being here will be short. So there's a temptation for you. We have as our witness from my left to right, Joe Billante, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for EMEA, eBay, Steve Dishman, who's the Vice President for Taxes Europe, Amazon, John Thompson, one of our regular frequent flyers here at the committee, welcome back, sure you've missed us, the Permanent Secretary at HMRC, and Jim Harrer, also a regular visitor, the Director General for Customer Strategy and Tax Design. Jim, Mr. Harrow, your title seems to change every time you come. So it shows a certain versatility. Let's hope we can be versatile on this subject as well. Before we move into the main session, and I'm going to ask Nigel Bills to kick off on that, I just wanted Mr. Thompson just to pick up. We've talked to you before about, you came up with a list of your key concerns about Brexit and the challenges. You just heard from the Professor earlier about the impact of Brexit on the customs element and the VAT element. Have you got any reaction to that? And have you got any update since you last spoke to us about the 8 challenges that you face in your already busy department?
Yes, and well, can I say for the 27th time, it's nice to be with you. I've got 28 and 29 in the diary. Well, I think Brexit's moved on. I'm slightly wary of the fact that the Chancellor gave quite a lot of evidence yesterday to a Lords Select Committee, which I think he set out the territory fairly clearly. I mean, clearly, there are 4 really big things that affect us. One is customs, and the position's moved on. The government's published a position paper in relation to customs and what the options might be. There's then the question about indirect taxes, in particular VAT. There's thirdly the whole question about data sharing and how we exchange with current EU countries. And then there's fourthly, it's worth the committee remembering that we have a significant element of the welfare state. So there's the whole question about residency and benefits and so on. I think we made significant progress in relation to customs in whatever scenario is available, both in relation to contingency of April 2019 or negotiated outcomes. We've also made some fairly significant progress on the underpinning technology, the Customs Declaration Service, and I believe you're having a hearing on that at the end of October. So a lot has changed, I think. We made significant progress in a number of regards. I heard what the professor said. I mean, I think we need to be upfront that the question of the operation of the border is primarily not one for HMRC. It's primarily one for Border Force, who then carry out functions for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But the government has made some very clear decisions that in relation to Brexit, we need to balance three things: the security of the United Kingdom, the raising of revenue and the free flow of trade. And we have built that into our positions in relation to the negotiation or a contingency. And we continue to work away at that. I'm very happy to get into what might that mean in terms of risks or staffing and so on. There are scenarios in which we would need additional staff away from the border, and the Border Force would need more staff at the border. There are certainly options where that scenario is true.
Can I just say, you said you're talking about contingencies and so on, but we know it takes a while for your systems to change, and for that change to come through. I think between 18 months and 2 years would be, I think, typical, if I'm right.
Sure.
So where we are now, and we're looking at a March 2019 date, what discussions have you had with the Treasury and the Chancellor about the transition period that's been mooted by government, and how long that would practically, I'm not asking you to comment on policy, but just practically would need to be for HMRC to make some of the necessary changes that are being discussed?
So we've had extensive discussions with Treasury Ministers.
And any conclusions?
You're trying to draw me, and I appreciate that.
But there is a serious practical issue.
Sure.
Whatever we all think about the policy, one way or another, that's not
so
really
look, if we stick to the paper the government has put out, it's put out the highly streamlined option or the so-called new customs partnership. In relation to the highly streamlined options, that is actually a basket of changes that we feed into the negotiation, 7 main changes. Some of those could be implemented in April 2019, some in 2020, some in 2021. So it rather depends on exactly how the negotiations go. There's not like one big change in relation to that.
So you're saying to us now
streamlined.
that if things go relatively smoothly, things stick to timetable, in other words, in the current negotiations, in 2021, HMRC could be ready with any changes necessary to the customs system to cope with Brexit?
Yes, could be, but one of the big...
we understand there are political variables outside
One of the
control.
challenges of this conversation is it depends when we're leaving and on what scenario.
Okay, I think we're drawing you into policy, which perhaps is a bit unfair of me, but we will obviously be coming back to this. And I know you're appearing before our sister committee tomorrow, and no doubt they'll have questions in this area. So you're off the hook for the moment, Mr Thompson, but we'll be back. Could I ask Mr Nigel Mills, please, to kick off with the main questions on today's session?
So, Mr Billante, Mr Dishman, thank you for coming today. We just start. I mean, it's a lot of money the taxpayer's losing here. I mean, haven't both your companies just been turning a blind eye to this for a long time? Mr. Billante, do you want to start?
Sure, great. Thank you. This is only my first time on this panel.
We're friendly now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. So, look, I can't speak to the estimate of the total potential VAT fraud that's going on. We're certainly generally aware. But I will tell you that we take this problem very seriously. It's a legal, financial, and reputational risk, but it's also just good business for the majority of our platform, most of which, by the way, is actually domestic UK sellers. But specifically to this issue, we've been working on this for quite a long time with a lot of resources. I actually chair a cross-functional team that has been dedicated to this problem. I arrived in Europe a couple of years ago from another role in the company, and there were already teams working on this. And we added even more resources to it. We have 210 people working just on VAT fraud beyond other risk management work we do at eBay. And to date, our actions, we think, have had a lot of success. Some of that is partnering with HMRC, using some of the new powers that were mentioned earlier. And so while I can't speak to the total size of this problem, certainly what we see is, we have taken action on our own site. We've suspended... We've blocked many sellers from our platform where we've received notifications from HMRC that they're not compliant. We also have our own internal efforts. Yeah, so we've received 77 notices to date and 184 individual sellers, which we've blocked.
So it's all because HMRC has notified you? Not
Yes, those
because you
are
found
the
out.
ones from HMRC. In addition, we have another 893 accounts that have been a result of our own internal efforts. So, where we have eBay policies that go above and beyond the legal requirement, and so we ensure that people follow all of our policies, but specifically related to this issue, we have taken action against more sellers. And so in total, 1,077 sellers over the last few years, and we continue to dedicate people to
Mr.
monitor,
Mills.
to watch for this issue.
Sorry, I'm being brisk because
So what-
we need to be brisk, really.
What is eBay's policy, Mr. Billante? Is it that a seller that tries to sell without VAT when they should be charging it will be blocked, or is the policy more confused?
So first of all, we can't know who is compliant or not. That's something HMRC has to help us with because we don't have access to their taxpayer records. What we do is we say you must comply with the law, and then we also, for foreign sellers who are the primary focus of this issue, we require that they display a valid VAT number, which we check through the VISE system. And we make sure that that sellers display that. We've also asked them to put that on their listing. We've been told by HMRC that that's not an actual legal requirement, and there's some debate about that. But regardless, it's our own internal policy that they display that. So we've worked over the last few years, and today, a small portion of our overall platform is made up of these foreign sellers operating, and 98% of their listings display a valid VAT number. What we can't know, and why we work together with HMRC, is to figure out who's actually complying and paying their tax. We're a third-party platform. I can't know that. What I can make sure is that people follow our policy and that we take appropriate action.
Mr. Mills?
Or can we let Mr. Dishman answer?
Mr. Dishman.
So, again, thank you very much for the invite here today. We also take the issue extremely seriously. Extremely important for our marketplace that there's a level playing field. We want sellers to trust in the integrity of our marketplace, and for our customers to trust in it. We're a long-term focused company, so we take it extremely seriously. In terms of the way we think about the issue, we think about it in two areas. Area one is we think the vast majority of sellers want to be compliant. Now, when you're selling internationally, they may not understand the rules, and then there's always going to be a bunch of small bunch of actors who do not obey the rules. So we're kind of focused on the first group first, and then I'll talk about what we're doing in the second group. In the first group, we're working on an extensive educational efforts. So that's web pages, webinars that we're running. We're doing supplier conferences around the world in multiple languages to educate people on the requirements. And this isn't just an issue for overseas sellers selling into the UK. It's an issue for UK sellers selling into Europe. We have 60% of our UK sellers now who are exporting. That's created like 1.8 billion of exports out of the UK. So it's very much an issue for the UK selling out as well as selling in. So focus on the education. The second piece, which is then key, is how do you make compliance easier for those sellers? VAT is quite complex. You're selling from Asia into the UK. How do you make it simpler? So we've invested in both reducing the rates and negotiating reduced rates with some of the big accounting firms to do the compliance. And then we've also been, over the last 2 years, been developing a technology tool. The aim of this technology tool is to really simplify compliance, is to take all of the data that exists on Amazon and with 3 or 4 clicks of the button to be able to do the VAT returns for all across the EU. So we think that's a really important step. That we're focused on there, and that will also allow all UK sellers who are exporting into Europe to use that tool. So that's been a big investment. So that's kind of what we think of the majority of sellers who want to be compliant. We do think education is a big piece of this issue. On the second piece, we're working very closely with HMRC in terms of sharing information on sellers for them to be able to do their investigation work. We are now in a position where we've shared data on all of our non-EU seller population, which is the group I think the committee is most interested in. So we've shared data on all of those sellers today. When we get the notices back from HMRC, we act very quickly. We act within 24 hours. We take them down, very quickly.
Okay. I'm just going to say we do need to those useful fulsome answers for the beginning. We'll need to be a bit faster, unless you could be here afternoon. I'm sure you'd be very happy to be. But if we want to finish on time, we need to be a bit sharper. Mr. Mills.
Quite intrigued that Amazon now favour a level playing field, but perhaps that's another day's topic. Can you just correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Dishman, but for a lot of these transactions, you also fulfil them. So you kind of know that the seller's based outside the EU. You know the goods are in the UK because you're shipping them to the customer. I mean, it kind of beggars belief that people can trade at all, or ever be allowed to sign up in that situation without being VAT compliant. I mean, you're not just saying lots of nice words about videos and discounted tax advice, but in reality, I mean, couldn't you just stop this happening at all?
So you talk about the, I think the non-EU seller population who are using our fulfillment by Amazon service, which is where we offer the fulfillment service. Again, that's about half of our sellers use, half of those non-EU portion use that service. For those who use that service, one of the difficulties I think we face, as well as all of the other marketplaces, is understanding, even if a company is VAT registered, is it ultimately paying over the VAT and then paying it over to Hmrc? It's really Hmrc will only be the people who actually know for sure whether that's happening typically. In other words, whether they're putting it on their VAT return. That's why we're doing the very extensive data sharing with Hmrc, so they can do that, and we think it's working. We've had from Hmrc over 400 notices to take down sellers. So we think the process is working well in terms of that data exchange.
Mills?
I mean, do you not think that the solution to this, in reality, would be for you to collect the VAT before you pay the sale money back onto the non-EU seller and pay it over to Hmrc? Certainly,
yeah. I mean, it's a good point in terms of what would be what is the real long-term solution for this. There are different solutions out there. Professor mentioned one of them. There's a consultation out from the UK government at the moment on the split payments legislation, which I think is certainly an interesting idea. And the concept of split payments is that an amount of VAT would be deducted by the financial intermediary, could be a bank, financial institution, or the marketplace, and to deduct that VAT from when they receive the remittance in. Now, that I think can be an attractive methodology. As long as it covers all marketplaces. We have Amazon and eBay here today. I think one of the keys here is that it covers all marketplaces. So, there's a lot of...
But you're saying you wouldn't have a problem, and Mr. Billante, same question to you, introducing that system, just of taking the payment?
I think we're a little bit different business. I think it's certainly worth exploring the right way to tackle this problem, and that may be a good solution. I think the challenge will be where...
But PayPal is one of your companies, yeah?
No, actually, we're separate businesses. We separated the companies in 2015.
Forgive me?
So they're a completely independent operation now.
Okay. But Mr. Dishman, you could technically do
that. We could do it, and as long, we support the idea in principle. I think the key is to ensure that it covers...
So if you couldn't, you're saying you wouldn't do it because you wouldn't want to go it alone?
We would do it, but I think it's key in this kind of business where companies can move between marketplaces.
Well, that's
very
what I'm saying.
easily.
So if you could do it, but you wouldn't go it alone, you'd want
to
do it...
We would be supportive of legislation as long as it is full in total. And I think that's not just, obviously, important for Amazon, but it's important for the public.
I just want to ask Mr. Thompson, but before we go back to our witnesses from the marketplace.
Yes.
For one, is the data, or maybe Mr. Harrop, is the data that these marketplace platforms are providing to you proving useful?
Yes.
Okay. And have you, as a result of that, sped up? What's the number of people that you're now catching through this process? Has it gone up since you changed the rules last year?
So I think the way we think about this is there's three parties to this. There's a seller, a fulfillment house, and a consumer. And what we've been trying to look for is a systemic solution that requires all three parties to comply so that we, in the end, collect the tax. So in relation to the seller, it's either register or get a joint and several liability notice. So the number of online retailers from overseas registered for VAT has risen from 700 at the end of 2015 to 17,537 at the end of last month. So the significant rise in the number of online retailers who are now registering for VAT, accounting for VAT and paying the tax. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to comply with that, and given that that's a 16,800 rise, then we will issue a joint and several liability notice. We've issued 399 of those. All of those sellers have been removed from the markets. Now, does that cover the entire population? Possibly not, but we think that we've made significant progress on the seller. There's more to do. On the fulfilment house, you'll be aware that we have announced the fulfilment house due diligence scheme starting from April 2018. They'll all have to register. They have to go through a proper person test. At that point, the fulfilment house has to check that the goods which are entering their fulfilment house are registered with someone who's VAT registered from overseas. So we then have a double check on what is entering the fulfilment house. And then ultimately, there is the question here about could we have a split payment on the consumer when they actually pay to the merchant acquirer? Now, under current EU legislation, that is not possible. Nevertheless, we have had a call for evidence to see what business would say. We've closed that in June. We can't find any other example anywhere in the world of a split payment arrangement, so we're trying to push forward with that. And it's for ministers now to decide whether they want to. So if you think about it in the three parts, the seller, fulfilment house and the consumer, we've tried to tackle all three elements of the system. I think the data is very strong. The good professor said, a year in, has it made any difference? Seems to me that if you've gone from 700 to 17,500 people registering, there is a strong case that it is making a systemic difference, and the estimate of the additional revenue here is more than £350 million a year.
How many of those 17,500 VAT registrations are you collecting VAT from? I mean, are they all paying you money, or are they just registering?
As far as I'm aware, but if you want me to give you a very detailed answer, about how much are we collecting and so on and so forth, then I'd happily go back and find it.
It would be helpful. The registrations have gone up, and I think Mr. Mills is right. It highlights it.
We do expect that by, in this calendar year, 2017, that we will collect about £50 million more VAT from those traders as a result of the additions to the registration.
But we're losing £1.5 billion, Mr. Harrer. I mean, 50 million's nice, isn't it? But
yes, it's only a part of it. So we've got, we have a sort of a number of approaches to this. So first of all, we get revenues from the assessments that we make on the businesses who we compulsorily register. Many of them being the ones on which we have served joint and several liability notices. We get revenues from those that have been prompted to step forward and voluntarily register. We also get revenues from our National Import Task Force, which uses customs legislation to enforce import VAT at the border, and who also seize goods from the fulfilment houses, and several fulfilment houses being closed down as a result of that intervention. So I think it's multifaceted, but it is, we do not yet have all the powers that we need to tackle this problem. In the bill that's before the House of Commons at the moment is the fulfilment house due diligence scheme. The government has also now called for evidence on a split payment system. There's no doubt that we will need more powers to bring this gap down to a level which is a sort of normal level of gap, if you like.
What's the normal level of gap? Come on,
well, I mean, if you look at the VAT, I mean, we're constantly pushing the tax gap down. But if you look at the VAT gap overall, it was at its lowest level when we last declared it for 15-16 at 9.6%. Do I want to get it lower? Yes, I do, but that is below the EU average. It's about the same as Germany, for example.
Target? If you want to get it lower, you do. What's the target?
So, well, we just constantly want to get that down, but the level of gap in this area of non-EU sellers selling on online platforms is very, very significantly higher than that, and it is, so hence all the problems that it's causing to UK businesses, which I think, contrary to the impression that previous witnesses wanted to give you, we take very, very seriously, and we've been acting very urgently to tackle. But there is so much we can do with the powers we've got, and we are asking for more powers. On the split payment, I would say, as John says, we cannot do that.
We come back to the split payment, but because I want Carolyn Flint to come in on a couple of these points. Ms. Flint.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Dishman, how many non-EU retailers are on Amazon UK?
So let me give you a sense of our kind of our overall business.
Give me a number.
A number.
So we have 280,000 sellers on Amazon UK. Majority of those are UK. So it's around.
So how many answer the question?
For the non EU percentage, that's 16%.
16% of 280,000
of the sellers on Amazon UK are non-EU. Yes.
So that's around 50,000, yeah.
It's 46,000. Yes.
Okay.
About 50,000. Yes.
Okay. How many non-EU sellers with stock held at Amazon's UK warehouses are showing no VAT number or fraudulent ones are there?
So of the 46,000, approximately half use fulfillment by Amazon. So they have their stock in our warehouses. Okay, so you've got that's the 23,000. In terms of VAT registration numbers, our policy until the last 6-9 months has not been to go out actively to collect those VAT numbers, in the sense that VAT number itself does not guarantee in any way that a company is compliant. If the company wants to be fraudulent, they wouldn't ultimately pay over the VAT.
Because in the answers, I think from both yourself and Mr. Billante, about VAT numbers, I sort of was listening to it and I sort of got an impression there wasn't that much of a problem there, that actually there were these VAT numbers on the listings. But you seem to be saying, Mr. Dishman, that just because they've got a VAT number doesn't mean they're complying. My question was how many of the 23,000 non-EU sellers with stock held at your warehouses are showing no VAT number?
So again, it's not a data point that we think is necessarily that critical. We've since going out and
but if I could just hold you there,
yep.
if they are not showing a VAT number, wouldn't that send some alarm bells going? Now, I understand with both your organisations, when it comes to taking sellers onto your marketplace, there is hugely extensive, quite rightly, checks that are made, obviously the goods that are being handled, that they are safe, but also in terms of buyers, that there's redress for those buyers as well. And I find it just quite hard to understand why, as part of your systems and your algorithms and everything else that you've got going, why at least having the VAT number that you can then check against the listings that it's a valid one, aren't just an immediate part and parcel of the work that you do with these sellers.
That's a good point, and as I said, we focused on the education and compliance piece, the sharing of data with Hmrc.
No, it's not education. It's about why isn't that just instrumental as part of the registering.
So we are now going out and collecting all of those VAT numbers. So it's kind of a fourth pillar to the other activities that we're doing.
So I go back to my.
And we have about 60. I think the question answers the question. It's about 67% of the revenue of our non-EU FBA population. We have VAT numbers on file. I would reinforce that we've been going out and collecting those VAT numbers now. We've been going to the largest sellers first, so we're working through that list. It doesn't imply that the 33% are non-compliant.
So 67%, I think you just said, of your non-EU retailers, they have got VAT numbers against them. Or you're going
67% of the revenue from that population we have VAT numbers on file for, and we have again shared all of the data on our non-EU population.
We can see you've got that figure in your head, but do you have, or could you, even if you haven't got it in front of you, let us know how many of the total number of sellers who are non-EU, how many of them individually, because there might be a few that are very big, that account for quite a chunk of that 67%, and a lot of smaller businesses.
You were focused in this particular statistic on, in terms of revenue and the number of VAT numbers we have. Happy to come back to the committee with that data.
Caroline Flynn.
Thank you very much. The Amazon seller agreement states the following: we reserve the right to charge you any applicable unbilled VAT if you provide a VAT registration number or evidence of being in business that is determined to be invalid. How much revenue has Amazon recovered from VAT evading sellers using this method?
So I'm not sure I followed the question again.
So I understand that on the seller agreement, one of the part of the agreements you set up with anyone who wants to register with you as seller, it states, I quote, we reserve the right to charge you any applicable unbilled VAT if you provide a VAT registration number or evidence of being in business that is determined to be invalid. So my question is how much revenue has Amazon or with Hmrc, maybe come back to that, recovered from VAT evading sellers?
Right, I think that may be a slightly different question. Now, when we invoice our sellers, if the VAT treatment in terms of the way we invoice our sellers will be dependent on whether they have a VAT number. So if, for example, they have a UK VAT number, we don't have to charge them VAT. They have to self-account for it. So I think that's what the seller agreement's referring to.
Okay. But doesn't that apply to your the non-EU sellers
So
as well?
So the way the law works at the moment, and I think the professor talked about it earlier, is if you're invoicing the non-EU sellers, if they're registered or they're based in Asia or they're based in the US, VAT is not due on that sale. Now, the professor was talking about whether that law should be changed, but that's the law, and obviously we have to meet the law on that basis. So that's the current rule if you're providing services to a non-EU establishment.
What steps do Amazon take to ensure a removed seller does not simply remove stock, send stock back into Amazon under a different account and continue selling like nothing's happened?
So when we get the notices back down from Hmrc, we take them down immediately within 24 hours. We will have processes to stop them re-registering. Again, it's very much in our commercial interest to do that.
In the last year, how many people have you applied that to?
I don't have that data, but as a general part of all our sign-up of any new seller, we will have various fraud techniques. So we will look, for example, is it the same IP address? Is it the same address? Is there any fraudulent activity there, so that we would block them from re-registering again? So we would have those processes.
How confident are you in those processes?
Well, it's in our commercial interest that those work well. We do that, not just on VAT, but on all areas of non-compliance. If there are any loopholes, etc., we're always keen to, make sure that those are removed. But I think we feel confident, and if we see any areas for improvement, we'll address those.
Could you provide the committee with some data on how how many times you've used that process, say, in the last financial year, and another information about maybe how many attempts there are by sellers to try and reinvent themselves to come back onto the system?
I'm very happy. I think it's a process that we follow with all sellers when we take them down, or anybody who's new, who's registering. I'm very happy to take the committee through that separately.
Okay. Could I just start, I'm sure, Mr. Billante just asked a couple of questions. Again,
Sure.
I think your opening answers, you seem quite confident about how many of your sellers had a VAT number listing on their sites. But I understand that there's something like 20 different Chinese seller accounts who are using the same VAT number. Are you aware of that?
So I think, yes, the reality is that people use the platform in different ways. And so these aren't 20 different sellers. There's just reasons of pragmatism in terms of how they organize their business. So it may look like they have 20 accounts because they put certain categories of certain goods into different accounts. When we look at enforcement actions against our own policies or against notices, we take into account all of the seller's activity, no matter how many different individual parts they have on our platform, and we take action across all of those consistently.
But how do you ensure that actually people aren't just basically fraudulently copying someone's VAT number and adding it to their presence on your marketplace?
So we validate that everybody is provided a valid VAT, and then we ensure that they display that on their listings. We do look at the information in the VISE system.
How do you do that?
So we check the information in the VISE system relative to what they supply, and then we ensure that across all their listings, because all of our sellers have asked for transparency, we've worked really hard over the last few years to make sure that everybody puts it on their listing. Even though sellers outside the EU legally aren't required, we felt like it was a good thing to do, and we made it an eBay policy to require that, and that's why we've seen a significant increase in the number of sellers including that in their listing. The remaining 2%, we're working through those, and I want to get to 100. In some cases, people may actually have a valid VAT ID, and this is not legally required by them, but we are working with them to make sure it is. It's a small tail of remaining sellers left, but we feel like we've covered. We certainly cover the largest accounts first, and I'm pleased, but we can never let off with the vigilance around this issue, because people continue to try to come back.
Am I correct, Mr. Dishman, when it comes to Amazon and a company wants to register with you, even if they have other parts of their business, you just have one account with that one firm?
We typically have the one account by legal name, yes.
Yeah, but on eBay, Mr. Billante, I understand that's different. You can have companies that sort of, basically it's the same company, but they spread themselves around, which doesn't that make it harder to check them up and verify them in terms of their VAT credentials and what have you, and for Hmrc to then follow up to make sure they're paying?
Yeah, so we have lots of other information that links these together, and actually because we've received notifications from Hmrc about one particular account, we're able to link that together with all the rest of the related accounts. And so that's actually one of the reasons why I mentioned the numbers before. We've blocked 1,000 accounts, over 1,000 accounts. Some of those are because of our work linking together different pieces that the HMRC has helped us understand these are non-compliant sellers. We ensure that we find all of their activity. But again, I think it's a function of what the eBay platform and how it was built 20 years ago. Even large sellers in the UK have many accounts. If you look at some of the largest local domestic businesses, they operate many different accounts on eBay, and it's simply a pragmatic way to operate on the platform. It's not because they're actually individual sellers with individual accounts. It's just a...
In the UK, they're much easier to track down, whereas we're talking about these, overseas sellers, non-EU, Chinese in particular, that are happening. So, what might be a compliance measure or acceptable from a onshore business or within the EU may be different. Is that a fair comment?
It wouldn't make a difference in terms of our ability to link the accounts together. If the same seller wants to operate 5 accounts because it operates in 5 different categories, we're able to see that information internally as the seller signs up. We're able to link that together in our system.
Would you agree that all overseas sellers with stock location in the UK with no VAT number listed should be deemed non-compliant and they could be removed by eBay immediately?
So today the law is that they are not required to display the VAT. We have a policy where they must do that. We're working through with everyone. So for the remaining 2% that are not displaying today, we are in contact with them and we are trying to remediate that, and if they won't comply, we'll remove them from our platform.
Okay.
Sounds great, doesn't it? So
sounds like there's no problem.
I've seen if I went onto Amazon or eBay now, I wouldn't be able to buy anything without paying VAT that I should be paying.
So I certainly understand the general concern about the issue. I take this very seriously. This is not something where we spend a lot of time and effort with a lot of resources. It's why I champion the issue. It's why we have a lot of people dedicated to it. And it's not something you do one time.
We're
and
not
it goes
doubting
away.
you've got some resource dedicated, but if you're the business that's suffering from this, when someone if I were to report to you now a business that's not complying, how quickly? You say you take them down, I think, Mr. Tishman, in 24 hours, but is that on my report, or is that once you've got verification? Basically, how long can they keep trading at maximum before you take them off the platform?
So first of all, we can't know whether or not they're actually compliant. And whenever someone reports to us that they have a concern about another seller, we immediately tell them, please refer that to the HMRC. And we also, in many cases, make sure the HMRC received that. We also conduct our own investigation.
So you conduct your own investigation.
So we also conduct our own investigation on are they compliant with eBay policies. Again, I can't validate whether or not someone is actually paying. Right? I can only ensure that people follow the rules that we've laid out and follow the laws that we can enforce. I can't know whether or not someone is actually paying.
Well, you could check if they, for instance, had a false VAT number. That would be something you could check.
Yes,
quickly.
and we do, and we check in the VIS system.
How quickly would you be able to close someone down if you found out and that was the case? If I complained to you now about a company,
if someone came onto the site today with an invalid VAT number, they'd be removed today.
Today.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think Julian Keegan may be able to help you on this.
It sounds very encouraging. You've introduced new measures. You're working together to try and shut down this fraud. However, it is actually very easy today to go on either one of your platforms and buy something. So this example here is an Amazon purchase. It's light bulb socket converters, £5.99. 6th of September, ordered from Shenzhen Kuyida Trading Limited. You can tell us if they're still a valid trader later. An Amazon Prime purchase. We requested a VAT invoice, which I guess you could do. We got a reply from Minga EU with a commercial invoice, but no VAT number. Again, we've asked for a VAT number, and this has been outstanding for a week, so we still have had no response to date. There was another example, I think, earlier on, Richard had. It's very easy for anybody to go on today. Richard Allen from RAVAS, yes, to go on today and to find these sellers. So you're very sophisticated technology companies. I would think that it would be very easy for you to put in better practices to get rid of this fraud, to stamp down and clamp down on it. So what are you doing, and will this technology tool that you're going to introduce, will you be able to stop this fraud happening? And what can you do better to design systems to stop it happening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the underlying issues here is that we have information, but we don't have the complete information about ultimately whether the seller is paying that over to Hmrc. And that's
but you could make an assumption on some parameters, which you would do in your own systems if it was your own
ultimately
revenue.
don't know if what they filed on their return. We don't have visibility to that. We have 280,000 sellers. I do think the solution, if we want to have a kind of a broad solution, has to be a legislative solution that looks at that. I mean, I think what we're doing with Hmrc is working well. We've shared all of the data. They're acting on that data. It's clear. But I do think that we need to kind of look at, a legislative solution,
And yet we heard from the professor earlier that actually she believes the legislation is in place. It's the enforcement and the practices that could be improved.
Well, I think the professor talked about one piece of Belgian case law, which I'm, to be honest, not familiar with. But I think the legislation does need to evolve here. I do think it's critically important that it covers everybody. We've got Amazon and eBay here. I think we're both doing a lot of things. I think it's very important that everybody, is in the same boat from a policy perspective, because otherwise there will be bad actors, there will be marketplaces who are less diligent, and I think
well, I don't think you could be less diligent than this, Mr. Billante. Have you? Could this get through your system?
So going forward, no. We require that new sellers, as they come onto the platform, provide a valid VAT. So if you didn't see a VAT on that listing, you were unable to find that. That's not going to happen. We had like I said, a lot of work over the last few years to address the existing population, and going forward, we require this. So a new seller, based on our policies, would be in violation, and we would enforce against them.
So perhaps, Mr. Dishman, you could take some lessons from your neighbour then.
Yes, a question from Mr. Thompson. You estimated the tax gap of online sales in 2015-16 at between $1 billion and $1.5 billion, but you chose to take the $1 billion figure, the lower figure. Why was that?
We chose to use it for what purpose?
Well, you chose that as the preferred number that you thought the actual tax loss was.
No, that's not correct. We've estimated that it's between £1 and £1.5 billion. We have not said that we prefer the lower bound estimate. It is somewhere in that range, and the Office of Budget Responsibility has certified that is a reasonable range estimate.
Okay. So the problem was sort of first identified with this tax loss by this committee in 2011. You estimated that loss in 2015-16, since when you've taken some various measures, notably joint and several liability. Also, the number of online sales has gone up hugely. So where do you estimate the loss is today? Have the measures you've taken been effective, or has the rise in online sales meant that the total loss has actually risen from that 1.5 figure?
I think over a number of years, we and the committee have been aware of the risks that online selling poses to revenue collection and to businesses. I think it wasn't until 2014 that the focus really came down on non-EU sellers on the platforms. Clearly, there has been exponential growth in online retail. So in 2015, the Office of National Statistics estimated that it was about, I think, £43 billion. It was £51 billion in the following year. So it's growing all the time. That's total online sales. We acted before, whilst things are being looked at OECD and EU level. The UK government decided that it could not wait for that, and it acted quicker in 2016 with measures, the joint and several liability measures, which are clearly having an impact both in producing data for us to find non-compliant traders, but also in prompting them to come forward and register for VAT. And we have proposed a further measure to come in next year, subject to Parliament passing the legislation. And we've consulted on split payment, either with a view to introducing that post-Brexit, or with a view to seeking a derogation from the EU, depending on the negotiations, because currently we cannot implement that measure under EU law as it stands. So I think there's been a sense of urgency in doing this, and we have backed that up by deploying resources, and we've been given additional funding for resources to police this. So I think we estimate that we will reduce this gap with the 2016 measures by about a third to a quarter. But we need further powers in order to reduce it further.
Mr. Clifton-Brown.
So a third to a quarter. You're talking about reducing it by £500 million over what period?
So, so we've estimated it'll be £875 million total yield from the 2016 measures by 2020-21. The sort of steady state effect of those measures annually is about £350 million. The split payment measure, if it comes on board, will of course be in addition to that.
Have you given an estimate what the split payment presumably would fill the gap?
Not at this stage, because we've done the call for evidence. That closed in June. In fact, we've extended it a bit because the election...
No, but it's not whether or not it comes in. That's what the call for evidence was. But surely if you introduce a split payment and those systems were introduced by organisations like eBay and Amazon, the VAT would just come in.
Yeah, we believe that would have a very, very significant effect, but we have to gather the evidence about how practical it is and where the payment engines are and how the UK can enforce that. But yes, we would expect that to be a game change.
So within those figures, you heard the previous witnesses talk about the problem with the warehouses, the fulfilment houses. You asked the Treasury to give you another measure, the fulfilment house due diligence,
Yes,
which comes into effect next year.
Yes.
Have you calculated in those figures a reduction of the amount of loss in your 2021 figures, you say down to 870 million? Is that including the benefit you expect to get from that measure?
Yes, that is from all the measures that were announced in 2016, including the fulfilment house measure.
Okay, I have just one thing I wanted to raise. We were talking about items bought. This is another item we bought on the system. So these are cable ties costing £12.32. Ordered on the 6th of September. I won't name the company because I think they might have disappeared by the end of the hearing if they know that I've mentioned just the Permanent Secretary of Hmrc. Amazon Prime, Mr. Dishman. So it came quickly. Thank you for the delivery. We requested a VAT invoice. The reply came saying they could only provide a commercial invoice. We asked again for a VAT invoice and they said that they would be reported if I didn't get it. I actually didn't use my name in this case, so they weren't aware it was me. And the response was interesting. They offered to they said it was difficult to get the VAT invoice, so offered me 20% refund as compensation. I have to reassure the tax authorities I didn't take the kickback of 20% of £12.32. But Mr. Dishman and Mr. Billante, this is the sort of thing that's happening all the time. We found that out by just doing a little bit of a mystery shopping exercise. It's very easy to find out. Do you do mystery shopping exercises? And if, with this information, what could you do, Mr. Dishman, with this company, which I shall provide you with information of outside of this meeting?
So certainly if we received information like that they had offered a 20% discount, we would then take them through kind of our own set of takedown process. We would first of all validate the evidence. If you provided the evidence to say this is what was in an email, we would then take them through the takedown process, and we'd give them a chance, 30 days, to rebut the evidence, but then we take them down.
Well, what is there really to rebut that they offered me 20%?
No, we just check the evidence, and of course, as long as it's valid, we would take them down.
Okay, and what happens if they then shut down and then they reopen as another company?
So in terms of setting up as another company, as I explained earlier, we would have processes to stop them doing that, right? So we would have looking at kind of their IP address, their legal address, etc., to stop them just re-emerging in another form. So that would be the process we would have in a situation like that.
Mr. Thompson, or Mr. Harrow, what could you do with this information, and how quickly can you act?
We will happily take information from any party. We have a fraud hotline, 0800. Double check, 788 887. We had 113,000 calls last year. We will take information from anyone and we will act. I mean, you've had 3 examples now, I think. We'll happily take whatever evidence you want. And
we'll certainly provide you with the evidence. But how quickly can you get that seller out of the marketplace so that British businesses aren't losing out to someone who's selling me cheap table ties from, I won't name where it's coming from, but from wherever?
I honestly couldn't answer that question about how quickly we could do it. I know that we do issue joint and several liabilities fairly quickly, but I couldn't answer your...
Okay, well, we might ask you to take this one up and then feed back to us what happened.
Totally happy.
And, I mean, you ask... If I were to provide that information, I mean, in the meantime, there's companies that you would acknowledge are losing out. I'm not bringing in...
Yes, I would acknowledge that, and I think, as I said before, in answer to previous questions, there's 3 elements to this. We were trying to get to a systemic solution on the seller, the fulfilment house and the consumer. Where I didn't agree with the professor was, she says there's all the legislation you could ever want, you just need to act on it, but it's fairly clear to me that we do need 2 further pieces of legislation, one in relation to the fulfilment house, which then...
And then the split payment system.
And then the split payment system.
I'm going to bring in a moment Leila Moran and Bim Afalami, but Caroline, I just wanted to follow up on that.
Just very quickly, There's a complaint from traders that one of the reasons why HMRC has not been on top of this is that they have consistently, for some years now, going back to 2009, been reporting information, but they never hear anything back about what's been done. So if someone like, my colleague Meg Hillier reported this to you, does the person who reported it get informed about what actually happens? That's the first thing.
So first of all, any intelligence that we receive, we always act on it. We look into it and compare it with data that we hold internally and other external data to determine whether there is a real risk that we need to investigate. In this area, by the end of July...
Do you let the person who's informed you
know
what's happened?
We are constrained by confidentiality rules, which means that generally, whilst we can ensure an informant that we always take action on the information, we cannot tell them the outcome of the investigation.
Okay, so if in a situation like this, where you might have lots of people coming in, does within the organisation capture all this to be able to have a sense of the problem going? Because one of the concerns is reports have been coming in, you may be investigating, but the reason why you've been so slow is you haven't pulled them all together to see a more systemic problem that's happening within this market.
All intelligence is controlled under HUMINT policy. So in this area, at the end of July, we knew we had 1,187 pieces of intelligence from organisations like RAVAS and VATfraud.org. What I would say, and I think it's Mr. Dishman has mentioned that, those are cases that they believe are non-compliant. When we have looked into those, fewer than 3 in 5, in fact, have been potentially non-compliant and have required investigation. We use our own risk assessment as well, and in fact, we have identified about 4 times more cases through that route than through the intelligence, but nevertheless, the intelligence is a welcome addition to our own risk assessment work, and we welcome it, and we do follow up every case.
But I think, look, you've heard from Mr. Clifton Brown and from others, and from Ms. Flint included, that this has been known about since at least 2009. Your predecessor, Mr. Thompson, sat in, perhaps not this room, but in front of this committee in February 2016 and talked about these being the new kids on the block and that you were on it. Well, that was sort of 7 years after the problem was first arisen. I'm sure you can understand the frustration and the suspension of belief that it's being treated as urgent if there's not feedback on this. And frankly, if the company that I just mentioned, which I shall give you the details of, if they find that they are acting fraudulently, why can't you name and shame? Yes. What's the taxpayer confidentiality when someone's actually committing fraud? If you take them to court, which prosecutions is another matter, but if you take them to court, you'd name and shame them. And if you've actually found they're fraudulent and struck them,
we do have powers to name deliberate defaulters in certain circumstances, and about every 6 months we publish a list of them. There are quite tight criteria set by Parliament about who can and cannot be named under those powers, but the general rule is that because of taxpayer confidentiality, we are unable to disclose.
Now, we understand taxpayer confidentiality. We've grappled with this before, and we understand that there's an issue there. What change would there need to be in the law that someone that's actually caught defrauding the tax authorities, defrauding HMRC of VAT or any other tax, could be named more quickly? What change in law would we need to pass here in this House?
Well, as I say, there is already law there for deliberate defaulters in certain circumstances. You could review the criteria that apply. I think I would say that, from our point of view, what we are interested in is tools that enable us to ensure compliance, and whether naming, for example, a Chinese retailer will have any effect on compliance, I'm not clear. So, I think those are the kind of areas that you would look at. But what we certainly do with informants is we do assure them that we capture the intelligence. It is controlled centrally. Every case is risk assessed and looked at, and if it requires investigation, we do investigate, and we have done in relation to the cases that have been given to us in relation to this, where our own data has shown that they are indeed non-compliant, but some cases that might appear to someone looking at eBay or Amazon as non-compliant, when we investigate, that's not in fact the case.
If we've got a minute, and we'll come back to this, but I do need to bring Ms Moran in, and then Mr Aflami. Lady Moran.
In timescales for specific action, you've all taken pains to say what you do. I'm interested in the interaction between the companies and HMRC and getting the information back. So first of all, both Mr Billante and Mr Dishman, you said that you share VAT numbers with HMRC. How often do you do that, and how quickly does it take for them to come back with numbers that are acting fraudulently?
take this one first, if you like.
Whoever wishes to go first.
So we share the data regularly. We've agreed a kind of a monthly cadence in terms of the data. HMRC said we want this number of sellers. We provide that seller data on a monthly basis in a format that they've agreed will be helpful for them for their investigations. They provide us with, they will do their investigations based on that data, based on other data they may have, because obviously they've got information we don't have. Then they will come back to us, issue with us with a notice, and then we will take the seller down, or the business down, within 24 hours of receiving that. So that's broadly the process.
Can you take me through that middle section of time? So you send them the VAT numbers once a month. On average, how long does it take for those to come back with the people you need to take down within 24 hours? How quickly are they responding?
I'm not sure I have that data at the moment. I'm happy to go away and look at that, but I don't think I certainly haven't brought that with me.
That would be helpful, Mr. Thompson. Would you like to come in?
I hate to do this with other witnesses sitting to my right, but I think there's a risk that the committee could fall into assuming that there is some transparency between the two organisations. And I have to be upfront with you that there is not necessarily transparency between the two organisations, because there are questions about where exactly the data is being held in relation to the marketplaces. So we've had good cooperation, but some of the data which is held is not within UK jurisdiction. And so we cooperate, but we need to be clear that there is not complete transparency between our organisations in the way that you're employing. It is true to say that online marketplaces can access our systems to validate VAT numbers. But I do not think you should fall into assuming that therefore we've got transparency, complete transparency back the other way.
But can I say, have you got the powers to, I mean, obviously there are issues with data protection. We know there's issues with the US and data sharing. Where's the limit of HMRC's powers? If you feel there's an issue, you need to go and ask information from either the witnesses or any other platforms. Where are the barriers?
Yes, we do have legislative powers both in relation to specific data on specific cases and also on bulk data that we want for risk assessment purposes. And we expect cooperation, and we expect that data to be given to us voluntarily. If it is not given to us voluntarily, then we will exercise our statutory powers and we will issue notices. And people have a right of appeal against that notice, and ultimately that could end up in tribunal if they feel that they are not covered by the UK legislation. But we do certainly meet arguments that data that we want access to is not controlled from the UK, and therefore our UK legislation does not apply. We would not agree with those arguments, and we would pursue the case. But nevertheless, we do encounter them. It does mean potentially we will have to. Can you
liaise with tax authority? I mean, if we had an issue, say.
Yes, the other thing is that if the data is in a jurisdiction where we've got a treaty where we can exchange information, then we can go to the other tax authority and ask them to obtain it and pass it to us. Again, that takes time. What we want to see is the kind of routine flow of data that Mr. Dishman has mentioned, which we, to date there's been a transfer of a standing database. From now on, it'll be updates to that as new sellers come onto the marketplaces for us to check.
Was Marlon?
So, how often?
I echo what my fellow panelists have said. I think that the limit on going even faster with this has been the data and the ability to freely share all data on all topics. When there's specific data, we're very, very easily able to share information back and forth, specific issues. We have a law enforcement portal. HMRC's called that the gold standard. The process works really well exchanging back and forth. When it comes to bulk data, there is a challenge. So when there are cases of JSL notices, we receive the notices. We, within a day, know immediately all the activity, not just related to that specific account, but any other related activities across our platform. We work with the seller to understand that they have any intention of becoming compliant. And then before the 30 days, typically on day 20, but we look to do that potentially earlier as well, take action and block them from the platform. So we have a very good working process regarding the JSLs. What we're partnering with is try to navigate through the various data privacy laws and challenges for other jurisdictions, which slow this down candidly, but we very much want to share all the information because we see that as a limiting factor in going even faster.
Okay. Mr. Afalami.
I don't must be without a prop. So, got one now. You mentioned, Mr. Thompson, about the pieces of legislation or legislative action that you think would give you the powers that you believe that you would need to go further on this subject. You mentioned them earlier. Two quick questions. One is, could you just reiterate exactly what you believe those to be? And the second one is, in particular around the Fulfilment House due diligence scheme announced by the government, what are your views on that?
So in relation to the Fulfilment House due diligence scheme, that's in the finance bill. Yep. So assuming that goes through, then we would implement that in April 2018. And there's an underpinning technology project that would come on stream in April 2018. Yeah. Jim and I went through that the other day. We're in a strong place to implement that, subject to the House. So that would be one further step forward that addresses the middle party in this, as we said. And then the ultimate step would be on the split payment. Now, the process here is we can't implement a split payment under current EU law. We've had some evidence. We'll put that evidence together to put to ministers. Yeah. There has been, as the Professor said, the current presidency of the EU, which is Estonia, has been pushing forward in that regard. We've supported that, and they've been looking at whether they can implement that in 2021. Now, we think that we could implement it sooner than that if ministers decide to bring that forward to the House to give us additional powers.
You're in the process now of bringing this forward to ministers in the Treasury?
Well, yes, 2 ministers in the Treasury, and then it's for them to decide whether they bring it forward to the House, yeah. So on that basis, you'd have legislation on the seller, on the Fulfilment House, and in relation to the split payment on the consumer.
And that's what you think you need?
I at that point think that would take us a significant way forward, yes. I don't know if Jim thinks there's anything else.
No, I do. I mean, I would say that a working party of the EU Council is looking at another option, which is placing the liability to account for VAT simply on the platforms without the need for us to issue notices to them, and that's something that we're engaging with the working party on. I think.
What's your view on that initiative?
I think that is a potential measure that could potentially help in this specific area. I think the key advantage that the split payment option has over that is that it can be of much wider application than this specific problem in relation to marketplaces, which frankly have grown very quickly, and I don't know whether in the next 10 years they'll disappear very quickly and some other problem will come along. So I think we see split payment as probably a much more strategic solution, but I'm not saying there couldn't be value in the other one.
Chair, if I may, thanks very much. On your last comment around the fact that something else may turn up and be the new thing, if you could walk us through how it works internally within your senior and mid-level management within the organisation around identifying the potential new areas of fraud.
So first of all, we have a futures team which looks at future developments that will impact on the administration of tax and brings that into the policy making process and the operational planning process to make sure that we're taking account of that. Also, there's a limitation of our tax gap measure, which is it tells us we have a tax gap, but it doesn't tell us necessarily what's driving it. So we have something called a strategic picture of risk, and we have a risk and intelligence directorate which populates that, which says, you've got a tax gap. These are the key strategic risks that we see driving that tax gap, and they identified in 2014 that non-EU sellers on online platforms was driving an increasing part of the VAT gap, and that's what prompted us to come up with the 2016 measures. And we do frequent threat assessments on those kinds of new risk, because it is the fact.
And you're satisfied that internally, in broad terms, you're happy with that. You're not planning to change that or beef that up anytime soon. You think you can identify the new risks.
I think we constantly look at how we can get more responsive. If you look at trends over, say, the last 100 years, it took many years to get up to, say, 10 million people flying on aircraft. It took virtually no time to get up to 10 million people shopping on eBay. The world is getting faster and faster all the time in the way it changes. So, we have to constantly look at how we can get more responsive.
Okay, Gareth now.
Thank you. You very articulately explain what the problem is are with this particular way of selling at the moment, and both of you have, Mr. Dishman, Mr. Billante, yeah, sorry, and you've both said how genuinely aware of the problem, that you've got quite a lot of resource into fixing this, you've got a lot of time, it's something very seriously. So rather than just telling me what you're already doing, and without making it about simply the volume of sellers that you now have a VAT registered number for, can you tell me, if you were to come back in 6 months' time, what would have changed in your organisations? And what would have advanced that mean that you could be taking this even more seriously than you are now?
Sure. Happy to take that first. Sure. I think what you'll see is we'll still have the same level of resources dedicated to this. What we'll have is more and more technology enhancements to do this at scale. There are always ways that folks who don't want to do the right thing try to engage in our platform, try to find different ways back in. And we continue to build more ways of detecting, more ways of triangulating, and preventing that from happening. We'll be enforcing our policies. We will still be operating the way we do today in terms of ensuring that people display a VAT number, and we'll certainly be responding to any specific notices we get. I think there'll be more technical solutions. We run a complex global platform. Other jurisdictions beyond yourself are looking at more changes like this and things that we need to do. And so, for UK sellers exporting around the world and other sellers selling here, this is a challenge, and this is an issue that needs more and more technology to help solve and make it easier to comply, make it easier for us to detect and prevent sellers that are not compliant or sellers that don't follow policies to immediately remove and make sure that we're one step ahead.
Well, I'd echo much of that. I mean, we would certainly, all of the existing activities, we will continue to do those and double down where possible. One area I specifically would highlight would be the work we're doing on the technology development on this compliance tool, which we think is a really important step. So, it's not just, once you have a VAT registration, enabling all sellers, UK sellers as well as non-EU sellers, to do all their VAT returns with 3 or 4 clicks of the button. It's going to allow them not just to put their Amazon transactions on the on the return, but also they can import transactions from eBay, Alibaba, Rakuten, etc., and their offline transactions. So we see this as a little bit of a game changer, and it's something we're really quite excited about and investing heavily in.
Okay, Carolyn, Nigel Mills.
I think the risk is that you're painting quite a rosy picture. So I've got a couple of questions to Mr. Harrow, but first, Mr. Billante, Mr. Dishman. I mean, if my maths are right, if we're losing $1.5 billion worth of VAT, that must equate to $7.5 billion worth of sales at 20% VAT. And the NEA report suggests the total size of the market for non-store online sales was about $25 billion. Well, I mean, that's something like around 30%, a third of all, by value, all sales going through your marketplaces in the UK are actually non-compliant. I mean, that's not just a few naughty customers who haven't quite published their number. I mean, this is billions and billions of pounds of transactions. And I don't know what your UK turnovers are, perhaps you could tell us, but are you sure you can't actually spot this a little quicker and do a little more about it, given the real scale of it? Mr. Billante?
So, I can't speak to the $1.5 billion number or how that's calculated. What I can tell you is the data that I have in front of me based on the activity that we've seen. So, the notices I mentioned earlier, the 184 seller accounts that we suspended based on the JSL notices, those amounted to a total revenue number of £4.6 million in the previous year. So I can't reconcile between why the big differences are there. If I include all of the other internal actions that go beyond the law in violation of eBay policy, it includes 2.3 million listings, but it's still £9 million of revenue. So it's hard to understand again how to reconcile the two. But that's the data I have in front of me, and that's the actions that we've taken. The other thing I would mention is some of the online numbers you mentioned. I'm not sure if they're specific to this issue or not. In total in our marketplace, 90% of our business is still domestic sellers selling to domestic buyers. And so of the 200,000 professional sellers that are on our platform, the lion's share of those are domestic sellers. And even after that, the next biggest bucket are sellers within the EU. So, 157,000 of the sellers are UK based, and
sounds great. So
many more.
Mr. Mills?
So perhaps we could turn, Mr. Harrow. We didn't quite nail you down on some targets here. So we're losing $1.5 billion a year on a couple of years out of date. So when are you next planning on assessing what this particular tax gap is? Are you going to do an assessment once you've had your 2016 changes in place? Or?
I think we'll have to look at that. I mean, this tax gap was estimated for policy costing purposes and obviously for the 2016 measures which are going through. It is something that we will want to monitor, but it is a sort of top-down estimate. I think Professor Faria did talk about that there are a range of estimates there, and I'm not sure we'll be able to come up with much more precise one than that. But we'll certainly keep it under review.
So
I would say, looking at the proportion...
So when will we see a new assessment? I mean, it's a growing scale.
I mean, we publish the tax gap every year, and there'll be another measure of that due out next month. Whether we will be able to refresh this tax gap, we will have to look at, because it was done for a policy costing purposes to inform how much revenues we think we can get from the measures that we were introducing.
But you're about to cost a new policy of your split revenue. I mean,
well, potentially, and I think if we were going to do that, we would obviously want to look at what we think the impact of that will be. But what I can't do is sort of promise you that this is a very dynamic analysis that we can do, because it is an estimate, it's not a measure, but it is something that we'll keep under review.
So when will you assess how effective the 2016 rule changes have been?
Well, we're already obviously monitoring how much revenues we are getting from those businesses that have been prompted to register, from those that we have forcibly registered and we're taking assessments against, and also from the actions of the National Import Task Force. What's much more difficult, I think, for us to measure is the other behavioural changes. So, we've mentioned the number of sellers that have been taken off the marketplaces.
Okay, that's why you do the tax gap, isn't it?
That shifts the demand, hopefully, onto compliant sellers, where we would be seeing VAT being paid by them, and that is obviously not a behavioural effect that's very, very difficult to measure and capture. But we do evaluate whether we are achieving the yield that the OBR has certified that we will achieve.
I didn't hear many years or numbers in there, Mr. Harrow. I think what we'd quite like to know is, I think you suggested you'd want to get the tax gap on this issue down to the 10% that's the general VAT one. So, I mean, is that something you think you could do by 2020, 2022 if you got the split payments in?
Well,
what can you get it down to without that? Is it down to 15% without that next rule change? I mean,
so we have forecast what it is we believe we will achieve by 2020, which is about £350 million a year off this gap. So that does not bring it down to the kinds of levels where you would say there is non-compliance in here, but it is of the same magnitude as the rest of VAT payers, which is why we think we would need further measures. If we were coming forward, if the government comes forward with split payment proposals, they will indeed estimate what additional revenues they believe they will attain from that, and it may be that we will need to come up with a refreshed measure of the tax gap in order to support those costing.
If we've got a minute, Mr. Mills, we can come back for a last word. Ms. Finn.
Mr. Harrow, over 7,185 overseas sellers registered for VAT last year. How many have declared all their unpaid VAT?
That is, in some of them, has been very recent, so we have to track their performance. We do monitor that they are making returns and that they are paying VAT. Over a longer course, we may well select their returns for investigation to check whether the amount that they are returning is correct. I think there is a key risk at the moment, because of the welcome actions that the platforms are taking around VAT numbers, that some sellers will come to get a VAT number because that's what they need to keep selling on the platform, but may have no intention of complying, or may intend to comply but just think it's all too difficult and not do so. So we do have to follow through and make sure that those who register then make the returns, make the payments, and when we check their returns that the values they've been putting in there are correct. And that is something we are definitely monitoring these people and tracking their behaviour.
And where does clawback fit into all this? Because obviously these notifications, you've done some testing out already, and you've got in the report from the NEO some of the notices that have been issued. Yeah. Where does clawback feature in this?
Clawback in the sense of?
Well, clawback in the sense that they may not have been paying their VAT
Yes.
for some
They
time,
have
therefore it's
to-
not only getting them back on the straight and narrow, it's how much
They do
get
have
back.
they do have to pay their historical liabilities plus interest plus penalties. And for example, in the case of businesses where we've issued a joint and several liability notice and they're thrown off the platform as a result, we will not remove that notice until they are complying both going forward and they have settled their historical liabilities.
How many years back does that go, Mr. Harrow?
It depends on the nature of the non-compliance, but if the culpability that we can show is fraud, I think it's 20 years we can go back.
Are HMRC freezing VAT evaders' PayPal and Amazon payment accounts?
I'm not aware that we've got any powers to
You
do
don't
that.
think you haven't got powers to do that? You don't think? Would you like powers to do that?
That is something that I guess that we could look at. I mean, we have focused on the fulfilment houses and the platforms because that is where we believe we can intervene effectively at this time. Intervening on the payments would definitely need new powers, some of which I suspect will not be within our boundaries under EU VAT law. Certainly split payments, for example, is not.
Obviously, you're going to be looking to create a register of fulfilment houses, as already been mentioned in the committee. How are you going to do that? I think in the report it says between 500 and 3,000 fulfilment houses we think that way. Now, obviously, Amazon should be able to provide you a list if they haven't done already. They could provide it for you tomorrow for their places. But how are you going to track this and where are you going to get the information from?
So we have an evidence and research base which gives us the first 500, which we think is a sound estimate. The reason that we've gone to up to 3,000 is because we can identify from our own work, we think approximately another 2,500 businesses in the UK that look like fulfilment houses. So we know we've got a solid base of 500, but we think we've got an additional 2,500. The onus will be to register in April 2018. You have 3 months to do that, pass the necessary tests in order to be able to operate.
Is that for the fulfilment houses?
For the fulfilment houses.
Now,
yes.
their relationship to whoever they're working with, I mean,
Yes.
the overseas sellers, why can't, for example, the 7,185 overseas sellers who registered for VAT last year provide you with a list of the fulfilment houses that they're working with?
Well, they could, but we...
Wouldn't that make it
and
easier?
I'm happy to have a look at that idea. It's a good idea. Thank you very much. But,
Okay.
I mean, the technology that
Ms.
we've
Flint,
got...
you're wasted on this committee.
Thank you very much. No, I'm very happy with
I'm
suggestions.
notching up the yeses.
Yes,
I'll
it's
look
good.
at that.
That's good.
Yes, it's good. Short answers.
Right, okay.
Fine,
let me
good idea. Thank you very
okay.
much.
Okay, but you realise trying to get an efficient system for this rather than chasing your tail on this for these fulfilment houses is key. Okay, let me just add something else. We've got a copy of this Ipsos Mori report that HMRC presumably commissioned about prevalence of individuals shopping online from overseas and handling of VAT. I think at the end of the document, hot off the press, September 27.
Should have delayed that.
In one of the, it's basically.
I think it was yesterday. Very helpful.
Surprise, surprise, just before me. So in, I think, one of the last paragraph where it's talking about what more consumers can do, and it says, I quote, raising awareness of when VAT and customs duties should be applied could help give consumers the capability to identify compliant and non-compliant overseas sellers. And then it goes on to say, if consumers could be given simple tips on how to identify non-compliant sellers, this would enable motivated consumers, sufficiently motivated, to avoid shopping from them. Please, please reassure me, you are not offloading this problem onto consumers to sort out, because the report does also indicate that how complicated this is for consumers who tend to look at price and look at things like quality, but also with fulfilment houses, how on earth can they be your agents in regard to this? Please reassure me, poor old consumers are not going to be landed with the job of sorting this out.
I can reassure you in that. I mean, one of the purposes of carrying out the research was to understand whether we can harness consumer power to help us. I think one interesting sort of key bit of information that comes out of that is one of the top 4 reasons why a consumer chooses a particular seller is their seller review record on the platform. And we believe that that strengthens the power of the joint and several liability notices, because when they are kicked off the platform, they lose their reviewer history. If they come back as a phoenix, which is one of the risks obviously that the committee came onto, they do not have a seller review history to support them. So we believe that they will recognise that as a key asset.
So you're saying
they will
it's a
want to
part of,
protect.
but are you reassuring Ms. Flint?
Yes, I mean,
It's not
personally, I
the
think
main
that research
focus of
report
HMRC
shows
policy.
that there's pretty limited scope for us to harness consumer power, because a lot of them don't...
I'm glad to know, Mr. Hmrc, that you're a realist. I mean, we were like optimists, but...
Can I just finally go back to Mr. Dishman and Mr. Billante? I understand, Mr. Dishman, that Amazon does regular presentations at Chinese trade fairs to recruit overseas sellers. And I also understand Amazon either has or is in the process of buying a shipping company. And then alongside that, you have your own fulfillment houses. It does seem, and you manage the payment as well. And so in terms of the way the managing of the payment goes, is that you will take your fee over whatever product is sold. Now, I have to say, that sounds to me like a very embedded relationship with the seller. Is it not the case, Mr. Dishman, that actually Amazon is making profits from fraud?
So we're not part of the supply chain. I think that was what you were.
Well, you're delivering. I mean, seriously.
The,
I mean, you know,
the individual
you go to China, you recruit sellers. Is it true that you're buying a shipping company?
The individual businesses are selling directly to the end customer. We are providing a fulfillment solution to some of those sellers. That's what we're doing.
And the cash collection.
And the cash collection happens as well, doesn't it?
We provide the cash collection. Yes.
So, what is stopping Amazon at the point at which you're doing that cash collection, that you don't take off the 20% VAT and just basically hand that over to Hmrc, and at the end of the year the seller can check out through its return whether it needs to get a clawback from overpayment or pay more?
I think it's function of the law, and it's what we're talking about in terms of the split payments, because the whole idea for split payments would be to do almost exactly what you're saying. It would be to deduct an amount of VAT from those receipts, whether we do it or a financial intermediary
does it. But as
it
stands at the moment, if someone has cost, say, an item £400, and you take off, let's just say, out of that, I don't know, let's say 10%. You're taking 10% off that for your fee. If that company then does not pay their VAT, you have taken 10% of an income to that seller that actually is enhanced because they're not paying VAT, and therefore you have enhanced your payment as well from that company.
Our focus is very much on...
Is that not the case, though, that is happening?
We're not part of the supply chain. We are providing a fulfillment service.
No, but you are taking money has been fraudulently...
We are taking money, but that's not the way the law works. I think the change that you're talking about is very much the split payment method, whether it be a deduction from the receipts.
Whatever your relationship to the seller, the byproduct of both Amazon and eBay, Mr. Billante, and other online marketplaces, is that you are profiting from the evading of tax by these overseas sellers. That is just a fact, isn't it?
So the question's directed to me.
Is it not a fact that if you have overseas sellers using your marketplaces and they are not paying VAT, and you are taking money off them for every product that is sold through your online marketplace, whether you are intentionally or not, the fact is the system is creating you as profiteers from evasion of tax?
So to be clear, I don't want any of these sellers on our platform. If someone is non-compliant and we're notified and we have specific knowledge, we take action. Right? We know there is a general issue. We understand that. And what I will tell you is that, again, we also are not part of the supply chain, but we don't stop at the bare minimum of what the law requires. We go above and beyond that. We try to enforce policies that are more strict and do what we can. But as a third-party business, we don't own and operate any fulfillment houses. Well, we don't own any inventory. We don't have a payments business.
But Amazon is in a different place on this one.
You don't.
Mr. Dishman,
But
you own it.
I think I think it actually is a simple answer to a question. It is acknowledged in the NAO report there is between £1 and £1.5 billion a year being made in tax that is not being paid that should be being paid. And obviously you are the two big players in this online market in the UK. And therefore, we know it's going on, and therefore isn't it the case that through your relationship with these overseas sellers using your platform, that you are, maybe inadvertently in this situation, but you are profiting from the fact that these overseas sellers are not paying their VAT. So that your take is on monies gained that have not paid their tax. And therefore you are making profit over and above what you should.
I think I mentioned before the specific numbers related to the JSL notices in addition to our...
Mr. Dishman?
Again, we would like all bad actors off our platform, and we have a commercial interest in doing that. We want to have a level playing field that all sellers can compete equally. We have hundreds of thousands of UK sellers who are selling. Their exports are growing year on year. We exported 1.8 billion last year. We have a very much. That's why we're focused on all of these different areas. Whether it's education.
You answer Ms. Flint's question?
But you are. It is just a fact. It's just common sense. I don't know why it's so complicated. This. Everyone is acknowledging there is a problem with these overseas sellers and the way some of them are using their entry into the UK market. And we also know, let's not forget about this, the many, many businesses who are playing by the rules, who are being, finding themselves against a form of competition that isn't competition at all, and they are not only losing trade, their businesses are going under. So again, I say, you recognise that there is a problem that some of the people using your online marketplace, Mr. Dishman, are breaking the law and they are not paying their VAT. Is that correct?
We recognise that there are a portion of bad actors. Yes, that's why we're focused very heavily on all of them.
And each of those companies that are doing this and have been doing it, pay you a fee for your service. Is that correct?
They're also substituting what would have been a...
Do they pay a fee for your facilitating service?
We receive a commission. Again, this is a small minority of bad actors who we don't want them taking the sale.
I think you said it was a third
UK
earlier in the... I think you said it was a third. Well, actually, my colleague said it, but you didn't dispute that. So let's keep with the third.
The third wasn't. The third was a reference to the number of VAT registrations we didn't have on file for those non-EU sellers. That does not make them non-compliant.
Yeah.
The non-compliant sellers that we've received on are the 416 notices we've taken down. That represents around 92 million of revenue, about 18 million.
But we are talking about
still keep the commission on the things they sold.
We are talking about billions of pounds of VAT that is being lost to Hmrc and therefore being lost to the UK, and alongside that putting out of business legitimate businesses that are playing by the rules. But the question is this, whether it's a tiny amount, a middling amount, a colossal amount, the fact is this is happening, and therefore when these companies pay to Amazon their fee, you are taking fees on the basis of companies operating illegally in regard to their tax. And as a result of them not paying the tax they want, whatever percentage you take is probably higher than it should be. So you are profiting from this illegal activity.
We are focused on having a level playing field on our marketplace. That everybody can compete equally. It is in our commercial interest to have that happen. We need all sellers, the majority of whom are British sellers, to be able to compete equally, and that's what we're focused on. That's what our series of actions
I'll just ask this question one last time. If there is an overseas seller that is on your platform and they are not paying their due VAT, and in their contractual financial relationship with you, they pay you a fee, you are therefore inadvertently profiting from the illegal activities of someone using your marketplace.
We're focused on
Is that the case, yes or no?
We're focused on getting bad actors off our platform. We have a series of measures of doing that.
Mr. Dishman, can we just be clear? If they whether they're deregistered or not, if they're not paying their VAT, you've still got your commission. Amazon still takes the commission.
We receive commission, but our focus is on getting bad actors off our platform.
We've heard about, and we hear what you're saying about what you're doing to tackle it, but you are still getting the commission from people who have defrauded the British taxpayer. Okay. Can I thank you very much indeed for coming. The transcript will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. I just ask you if you could vacate the room reasonably quickly. We do have a vote at 4:30 and we need some time privately as a committee to deliberate on what we're going to recommend. Our report will be out in October or November, and Mr Thompson, we will send you information. In fact, we'll send you all the relevant information on the purchases that we made as mystery shoppers. Thank you.